Good evening. Welcome to everyone. We want to go ahead and begin our program tonight. On behalf of the Galveston Bay Area Chapter of the Texas Master Naturalist, I'm the president, Pam House, and I want to welcome you all. Many of you are members of our chapter. A few of you are new members of the chapter, and others are members of other Master Naturalist organizations throughout the state. And then we have few people joining us from other organizations. You are all welcome tonight. Tonight is a sad evening for many of us, and it bears talking about a little bit as we get started. The shooting today was horrendous. It's left many of us numbed, sad, wondering what to do. I think that this evening's program actually speaks to our need to reach out to each other, to understand each other, to expand our knowledge, forgiveness, and caring of each other. So I'm glad that you're joining us for the program, and I hope that we can have a good discussion tonight that will actually help in the healing. Before we begin the program, though, I would like us all to take just a moment to think about the people who lost so much today and take a moment of silence. So if you will, just take a moment of silence to think about and care about those folks who are hurting. Thank you. Thank you. So tonight is the fifth in our series of events that we're calling Community Advanced Training. And they're part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, where we're trying to find out more about how to reach out to others who share our passion about nature, about protecting our environment, about growing and educating and doing things that make things better. So tonight we're happy to be joined in our sponsorship of this event by the Iman Academy Southeast, the Multicultural Center, the Bay Area Unitarian Universalist Church, the Clear Lake Islamic Center, and Changing Hearts and Mind program. Thank you for joining us and sponsoring these. As I've said at previous presentations, we see these kinds of programs as really serving the purposes of the Master Naturalist program, which is to provide education, outreach, and service dedicated to the beneficial management of the natural resources and natural areas within our communities. And one of the best ways we can do that is to reach out to others in our community as we pursue these common goals. Before I begin, Chuck's going to put up our sort of rules of engagement for this evening. We've turned off your audio and video, and that's to preserve the bandwidth. But we do want you to participate in tonight's presentation. And the way you do that is by using the chat function. So please type any questions or comments into the chat. Our presenter will be looking at those as he makes presentations, but he'll be aided in that with our two Zoom assistants, the two Cindys, Cindy Howard and Cindy Liney, will be monitoring the chat and helping to make sure that we deal with any questions that come up. Chuck Snyder, of course, is our Zoom guru. He's our technical whiz in the background, and he'll be managing things for us. Before I begin, let me just say again how amazing the efforts have been of Mohammed Nasrullah. He is our Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. He actually it was his brainchild to do this series of programs, and he's continued to be the one who has sought out the presenters, organized it, made sure that we all stayed on the mark and did what needed to be done to make this run smoothly. So I thank him once again for making this possible. Mohammed, I'll turn it over to you now to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I agree that this acknowledging today's tragedy in Uvalde, just a few hundred miles away from here. It's another elementary school shooting. No doubt everyone's thoughts are with those who are killed, their loved ones, school staff, and first responders. May God bless them all. Like Pam said, this is our fifth in our series of DEI series of talks. Today, the title of today's presentation is A View from the Intersection of DEI and Park Advocacy. The presenter is Alan Spears. He is the Senior Director for Cultural Resources, Natural Parks Conservation Association, NPCA. Alan uses real life stories and a conversational style to connect with his audiences. So, like he said, he does not enjoy PowerPoint, so he does not have any presentation. He will be talking to promote NPCA's advocacy and the critical role the National Park Service plays in protecting, interpreting, and managing this nation's historic and cultural resources. A veteran advocate and a member of the Government Affairs Department of the NPCA, Alan leads community outreach and legislative engagement on a variety of park protection issues. Recent victories include joining with the NPCA colleagues, partners, and allies to win the designation of Fort Monroe, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad, Colonel Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers, Pullman, and Birmingham Civil Rights National Monuments. Alan's current efforts include National Heritage Area Program Defense, serving as NPCA's lead coordinator for the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Park designation campaign, and work in Mississippi to create a new national park site commemorating the legacy of Emmett Till, Mamie Till Mobley, and the foot soldiers of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. He remains the only NPCA staff person ever to be rescued from a tidal marsh by a park police helicopter. So please join me in welcoming Alan Spears for tonight's talk. Go ahead, Alan.
Mohammed and Pam, thank you for the introduction. For the moment of silence, I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C. And there's a lot of hurt out there. And so I'm sorry about the circumstances, but I am very grateful that you have chosen to spend some time here tonight, or this afternoon, this evening with me, to talk about something that I think is fundamentally important and maybe increasingly important as we deal with these times that we're living through right now. I had prepared remarks of the light and easy and informational variety. I don't know that that works anymore for the circumstances, but what I hope to do is to talk about that intersection between national park advocacy and justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, or what we refer to at NPCA as our JEDI principles. But just quickly, by way of additional background, I celebrated my 23rd year with NPCA last Thursday, May 19th. So I've been doing this for a while. If you can see on the Zoom, I've got a lot of gray up here. I refer to that as congressional gray. That's what happens when you spend a lot of time working with members of Congress and folks in the administration to try to do good things on behalf of our national parks. I'm grateful for the opportunity to chat with you tonight. I'm actually hoping that we can have more of a conversation. So the remarks will not be terribly long, and I hope that we can flow from them into a dialogue, a discussion, a conversation, because my assumption always when I talk to audiences like this is that there's got to be a couple people out there who are smarter about this justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion stuff than I am. And I'd like to hear what your thoughts are, what your experiences are, so I can steal wildly from your experiences and then incorporate them into my work to become more efficient. I want to start with this thesis about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. As an advocacy organization, expanding and diversifying the constituency for our national parks is critical to our success, the National Parks Conservation Association. And I'm willing to bet that diversifying your base of members, students, donors, and supporters probably makes sense for you too. And because I'm still naive enough to believe that we can, if given the opportunity, live up to the better angels of our nature, I also believe that the historic and cultural resources that our national parks preserve and interpret can play and should play a role in helping to regenerate our commitment to civics, stewardship, empathy, and maybe just baseline decency. I'd like to ask everybody who's on this call right now to picture an image of a national park. It could be a place that you spent a lot of time, could be a Texas national park, could be someplace elsewhere. And even if you've never visited a national park, if you've never even heard of a national park, I'd like for you to take a moment to picture an image of the sea of grass that is Everglades National Park in Florida, or think about the sound of the wind at Kill Devil Hills in North Carolina, where the Wright Flyer in December of 1903 first took flight, or the giant redwood trees in Sequoia National Park in California. Kind of go through that meditative exercise of thinking about those images or locking other images in your mind for a moment and hold those for a second. And then I want you to picture, if you would, a paneled room in either the House or Senate office building here in DC, the places where appropriators or members of House Natural Resources or the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee would meet to determine how or if new parks are established, how or if the National Park Service will be funded, and whether the principles guiding the management of our national parks should be based on the principle of first do no harm, or the idea that parks and all federal lands ought to be playgrounds that accommodate any behavior from visitors, including overflights, snowmobile use, mountain biking, and that they should be open to any and all extractive industries and practices, even ones that would irreparably harm the resources parks are meant to protect. And working with Congress, I can tell you from experience that some of the ideas that folks come up with are good ideas. Some are different and some are just plain horrible, but that's where the advocacy comes in. The National Park Service was established in 1916 to protect and preserve the natural, scenic, recreational, cultural, and historic resources that we the people determined to be significant. So we're more than 100 years into a commitment to maintain these places undisturbed for the benefit, enjoyment, and inspiration of current and future generations. The National Parks Conservation Association was established 3 years after the Park Service in 1919. And it was established by the first director of the National Park Service, who understood even back then that our national parks were going to need a watchdog, work dog organization to protect national parks from all kinds of schemes. And so that's the work that we've done capably on behalf of the American public. You can learn more about NPCA, who we are and what we do, by visiting our website at www.npca.org. But a warning, we share initials with the National Precast Concrete Association and the National Police Canine Association. So when you look for NPCA, make sure you've got the two bears and the green logo and some stuff that vaguely looks like it's about national parks, and then you'll know that you're home. The national park idea, if you'll allow me to disagree with Wallace Stegner, was not America's best idea. I would reserve that honorific for things like Head Start, the GI Bill, the space program, the Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, marriage equality. But national parks are a good idea and even a great idea, and their funding, care, and preservation are also fundamentally political, which is why advocates and advocacy groups like mine are critical to the well-being of our national parks. So that's a long preamble. What does that have to do with justice, equity, diversity, inclusion? What's the intersection, Alan? Our mission to protect America's national parks for future generations depends upon our ability to attract and retain members, donors, staff, and political allies who view their parks as relevant and our work as important. And as an advocate, I want to win more often. I want to win on park funding. I want to win on park management issues. And I want to win increased support for the people who work for and partner with the National Park Service. And to do that, NPCA needs the most diverse and engaged constituency we can muster on behalf of our national parks. And that's where our commitment to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion comes in. The history of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and Mohammed refers to that as diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. It goes by several names. Began in the early 1990s, and I came to it as an intern at the National Parks Conservation Association, and then as a new employee when I got the opportunity to manage part of our Enhancing Cultural Diversity program. And my job was to meet with NPS staff who knew or felt like they had to improve their connections to people of color and to organize communities of color, and also with communities of color who felt like they had some connection to national parks, but didn't quite understand what that was. And so I had to kind of be in the middle of both those groups and pull them together to coalesce around this notion of community engagement and national park protection. And believe me, it was slow work. I remember back in the 1990s, literally having white NPS colleagues ask me, so how do we speak to African Americans? How do we communicate with this diverse group, this group that was almost alien to some of our Park Service colleagues? And my response was a little bit snarky. I replied, have you tried English? And then there were more than a few community members who shared that the same apprehension that white colleagues might have felt when driving through an inner city neighborhood was exactly how they felt when visiting remote national parks. Terrified, afraid, unsafe. And so we had two communities here that had to be brought together. And it was a little bit like, I remember my first 8th grade dance, that everybody was on opposite sides of the gym. Nobody wanted to cross over to the middle and mingle. But it was important that we do so just for the success of the event. And it was important that these two groups come together in order to begin to create that large constituency, that active and engaged constituency on behalf of our national parks. The theory making the rounds in the mid-1990s, this national parks being America's best idea, was akin to the plot from the movie Field of Dreams. I'm not sure if people have seen that yet. I like the movie, so this is not a criticism of the movie. The notion was, if you build it, the voices told Kevin Costner's character, they will come. The national parks corollary is that because national parks were America's best idea, and because everybody knew and agreed that they were America's best idea, that people of all stripes would be drawn to Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon, and that those who weren't were simply exercising their freedom to not be engaged. Now, you may already have some sense of how poorly this approach actually worked. Despite being 12 to 13% of the US population back then, African Americans constituted less than 5% of the visitorship for national parks, and the NPS workforce was about 83% white. So this is not the visual that you want if what you're trying to achieve is a truly diverse and inclusive National Park Service. And in the meantime, a lot of environmental and conservation organizations were all watching the demographics clock tick and becoming increasingly aware of and alarmed by the fact that by 2040, Black and brown people were likely to become a majority population in the United States. And the question for all of us at that point in time was, what would it mean for national parks and groups like NPCA if this new majority had no interest in parks or in the environment? What it meant was that we were going to be in trouble. I want to take you briefly to a place called Manassas National Battlefield in Virginia, not too far down the road from Washington, D.C., as a bit of a case study. In the summer of 1861, about 3 months after the Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, rebel and Union troops met in battle on the fields near Manassas, or Bull Run. It's about 35 miles west of the nation's capital. Both sides hoped for a victory, even a victory that could end the war. And during the first part of the day, federal forces came dangerously close to routing their Confederate or Southern adversaries. until, that is, a bookish brigadier general and West Point graduate named Thomas J. Jackson solidified the Confederate line by resisting Union assaults. And it's reported that several of his colleagues on the Confederate side looked at his command and said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," which is where he earned that nickname. Jackson's command then launched a counterattack and drove Union forces from the field. Many of them skedaddled all the way back to the nation's capital and didn't stop until they were underneath the shadow of the unfinished Capitol Dome down on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, that is history that's worth saving and protecting, and Manassas is one of several Civil War battlefields managed by the National Park Service, including places like Shiloh and Gettysburg and Petersburg. But on something of a regular basis, Manassas National Battlefield is targeted for incompatible development. Currently, there are some data centers that are proposed right on the boundary of the national park that would ruin the viewshed and undermine the historic integrity of the landscape in that area. But back in the 1990s, Manassas was actually threatened by a Disney-like theme park that was proposed to go in right next door to the battlefield. I find often as an advocate for national parks that non-park people who champion these kinds of incompatible developments are often motivated by economic opportunity. And they share that economic argument to non-park people in communities. And the battlefield, they argue, provides no support for its surrounding community, especially if that community is increasingly Latino, as Manassas was then and remains now. And Latinos and Hispanics who have perhaps fallen victim to the lie that they have little or no connection to US history or the American Civil War. For a potentially detached population like this, a theme park, fun for your entire family, or a big box store that could mean jobs and retail opportunities in your neighborhood might sound like a much better thing than some grass and a plaque commemorating where the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment charged some guys from Connecticut. So we had some work to do. But in the end, the theme park proposal was defeated by a not terribly diverse, but very committed coalition. But the episode got many of us thinking, including folks at the National Parks Conservation Association, about next time. Because what happens if, again, there's another incompatible development proposed for Manassas or Gettysburg or Yorktown Final Victory or Yosemite or Yellowstone? What happens if we don't have the communities with us, these new diverse communities who don't see any relevancy? So we got started on reframing the national park story. And as I've shared, I think that the notion that national parks are America's best idea is limiting, because if you follow along the "if you build it, they will come" concept, it assumes that national parks are at the center of everyone's universe. And I think this is a dangerous concept, but it's also a dangerous concept that's easy to overlook. Quick example, if you were throwing a dinner party and you didn't know all the guests, would you assume everyone likes broccoli or that all of your guests drink alcohol? I think you'd actually probably ask. And in asking, you would allow people to share with you their preferences. And that's what I think environmental organizations like NPCA or Texas Master Naturalist and other organizations like the Audubon Naturalist Society, other groups like that, have to get better at doing, which is allowing people to choose when and where they enter, as opposed to just doing a buffet approach, which is, this is our mission, this is our vision, are you with us? We've got to be a little bit more open and a little bit more flexible in order to really bring in those diverse groups that we want, that we in fact need, in order to make sure that we are able to achieve our mission and our vision. It's hard work, and there are all kinds of opportunities for failure as well as success. Back when I first started at NPCA, our marketing department purchased a list of African-American names from a broker, and we sent everyone on that list, was several hundred names, a brochure about national parks. And on the cover of that brochure, there was a snow-capped picture of the Rocky Mountains and a grizzly bear, two of the most iconic images associated with national parks. We didn't hear back from anybody. We didn't get any new members that joined NPCA based on that mailing. And there were a couple of people within the organization who concluded, well, clearly Black people are just not interested in parks, although nothing could have been further from the truth. It was only several years later when we actually got to speak to one of the people who had received that mailer and who didn't respond to it, that we heard about the way that many of the folks who received that mailer responded to the imagery on that. The assumption was that people who lived in urban areas would climb to the top of a very cold mountain, that they would be completely out of breath, which is exactly when they would be attacked and eaten by that bear. So there wasn't anything in that mailer that spoke to relevancy, that spoke to a connection between the people that we were trying to engage and national parks. Several years later, when we redid that mailing with a different list, primarily aimed also at African American people, but we featured photographs of Harriet Tubman or Buffalo soldiers or civil rights icons, the response rate increased exponentially because we had found the ability to connect with people where they were, not where we wanted them to be, and not where we were. We have definitions about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that they're important. When we talk about justice, it's about access to common lands. And it's about the understanding that in too many instances, the land we regard as national parks belong to indigenous people or other non-federal landowners long before they were parks. Justice also has to be a substantial component of the way that these sites are managed and the way the stories are interpreted and shared. Equity, the mantelpiece of American history, is large and it's got a great deal of room and capacity. We need space for Robert E. Lee and Harriet Tubman. And we need to be able to honor traditional cultural knowledge as well as the Manhattan Project. And we can't continue to be in a place where we anoint one and then subjugate another if we want all people to be involved and to see their history, their contributions as being relevant. Diversity, it's a commitment to a national park system that tells the stories of all Americans, that welcomes all people, and that maintains a workforce representative of the American people. And inclusion, the way that we tell stories has to be accurate and it has to include all relevant perspectives. Our history can no longer be limited to men on horseback clutching swords. And even with the stories related to the American Civil Rights Movement, we have to move away from the understanding, the inaccurate understanding, that our civil rights history in this country is black and white. It's got a much broader, much deeper, and much more compelling and inspirational storyline than just black and white. Now, within NPCA, our internal JEDI work really began to reshape itself in the 2000s. We created a number of internal teams. Some lasted for a while, some were short-lived. But we began to focus on this notion of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And like diversity, equity, and inclusion, when you get towards that premise, as opposed to just enhancing diversity, there's more of a discipline, there's more work, there's more practice that's involved, and there's more of a commitment. And so NPCA spent about 10 to 12 years really developing the JEDI understanding and mission among our staff and among our leadership. I don't think that we've reached the end of our journey. I don't think that anybody ever does reach the end of this journey, because we are all still learning. We are all still moving towards that finer point. But I would say that the success that we've had is predicated upon the commitment of our leadership to this mission. And that commitment includes paying for staff to undergo trainings and in-service learning opportunities. In other words, we don't just say that JEDI is important, but we're actually willing to send people to workshops and webinars and to get them the books, the learning tools that will help them to improve their practice and enhance their practice. We're committed to work on park advocacy projects that make our advocacy more relevant to people of color and to non-traditional national parks constituents. We've committed to equal pay. And we're committed to maintaining a staff that is comprised of 40% people of color, people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, and not just all clustered in one area like accounting or HR, but spread throughout the organization, people of color who have the responsibility for helping to shape the vision, the mission, and the work of the organization. And we've created a family-first work environment, which means that especially over the last couple of years, when we've all had to deal with COVID, when many of my colleagues have children who aren't in daycare, or folks like myself have elder care responsibilities, that we understand that we've got a commitment to do the work, but we've also got an organization that will allow us the flexibility to be human in the way that we do that work. So my hope with this is that I've given you a sense of what justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion means, that to sum it up, we don't necessarily think often of national parks being inherently political, but they are. And politics does mean negotiating with people in a way that you can get what you want on behalf of what it is that you're working to protect and preserve, what you cherish. I care deeply about America's national parks. I care deeply about our environment, our historic and cultural resources. I want them to be well maintained and well managed, well respected and well regarded. I want them to be just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive. I want them to be relevant, and I want them to tell all American stories. But I can't do that on my own. I need the assistance of activists. I need the assistance of the people who are on this call. And it's important to recognize that we have to make ourselves open and relevant to the people that we are inviting into this movement, as opposed to, again, making them walk through our front door and comport themselves to the way that we do this work. If we practice these Jedi principles, and if we incorporate them into our lives and into our work, they might help at least a little bit to embrace those better angels and to listen to them, to learn from them, to follow their course. And that just might be the thing that saves us all. So I thank you for your time. I will end my remarks with that, and then let's see if we can go to the chat. And if anybody has any questions, just sort of drop them in the chat. It's, I'll see what I can have here. And there's a question from Ruth. Some DEI efforts operate under the assumption that people of color are interested in the org's activities and are only uninvolved because they face obstacles, financial or logistical, for instance. Is that a fair basis for strategizing an increase in diversity in membership, or is it a flawed assumption? Ruth, it's good to see you. Thank you for the question. I think it's a little bit of a flawed assumption. And this is something that we actually get to with the National Parks Conservation Association when we start to talk about fee increases for the National Park Service. Folks may understand that some, but not all national parks charge an entry fee, and the money collected from that generally goes into a large pool. A lot of it goes back to the parks that are charging that fee, and it'll help with everything from repairs to infrastructure to, I remember being at Shiloh National Military Park in Tennessee a couple of years ago, and they had used some of their fee collection revenue to create a new video, a new interpretive video for their visitor center. And when we talk about increasing park entry fees, there is always an argument that that might actually undermine efforts to diversify the park constituency. And the assumption is oftentimes that people of color don't have the revenue, don't have the ability to pay. I think we do have to consider the impact of increased fees on low-income people, but I think we also have to consider that you know, this deep in the 21st century, we do have a lot of Black and brown wealth in this country. And in Washington, D.C., I grew up in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. I go back to visit my mom, was just there earlier today. And I can tell you, simply because I can tell on trash collection days, the number of takeaway cartons and pizza boxes that are in the garbage would indicate to me that the people in that neighborhood have a fairly substantial amount of disposable income. Don't order pizza for 1 week and you can get yourself into just about any national park. You can buy a lifetime park pass. And so while we want to be concerned about low income people being priced out of parks, we also don't want to make the assumption that all Black and brown people are unable to afford the cost of getting to these places, unable to afford a flight, a rental car, the entry fee, hotel fees, those sorts of things. So I think you do have to consider where you've got to do a little bit of study about that. You can't just make the assumption. And there's another question here. Could you tell a little more about how you spoke to the concerns of communities around Manassas to change the planned development? I think the first thing was simply to make people aware that there were proposed changes that would that would undermine the historic viewshed. And for anybody who's ever spent time on the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic in Virginia, if you are a Civil War buff, Civil War nut like I am, if you've ever been to Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, it is one of the most heavily compromised areas in terms of historic integrity on the planet. And when Congress got around in the late 1890s, early 1900s to protect and preserve some of these Civil War battlefield sites, they never envisioned that many of these communities would become bedroom communities for Richmond or Washington, D.C. And so they were very limited in the way that they proposed boundaries for national parks. They wanted to make them as small as possible. And as a result, you had lots of opportunity later on, 20, 30, 40 years down the line after designation, for a lot of these sites to be compromised by incompatible development. And one of the challenging things about being at a place like Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania is if you are doing interpretation, which I've done, you have to tell people, okay, over there where the 7-Eleven parking lot is, was where so-and-so's division was. And then if you look over there next to the hospital, back of the hospital is where the Union forces were. And I think we were able to share with people that this was exactly what would happen at Manassas if that theme park went in. You would be looking at a loop-de-loop that would be yards away from where some of the most significant action in the American Civil War had taken place. And that's not why those parks were set aside for preservation and perpetuity. Now, a quick word, because I don't want to get a reputation for as someone who is completely opposed to development. It isn't that. It is that in many instances, these developers want to cash in on being next door to a national park. So you want to put something that is incompatible next to the Grand Canyon because you know you're going to have a bunch of people heading to the Grand Canyon who will then also go to your world's largest slip and slide. And so it's possible in many instances, in most instances, to move those things to other places where you're not going to be impinging upon a historic viewshed or ruining the view of a national park or compromising the historic integrity of a historic structure or site. And so that's what I think that was the argument that we made to people in Manassas and other organizations. They were the Civil War Trust at that point in time, now the American Battlefield Trust, Preservation Virginia, a number of partners were engaged in that coalition. And all of us worked diligently to make sure that people knew what was at stake. And I think once they learned what was at stake, and then once they learned that the development didn't have to happen right next door to Manassas, I think that got people on our side. Let's see, can you highlight a few best practice examples that you have come across where parks have integrated justice, DEI into programs and practices? Yeah, there are, let me see if I could think about a really good example of, I've been working with a number of new national monuments that were established under the Obama administration. And a couple of them, places like Birmingham Civil Rights in Alabama, Freedom Riders, also in Anniston, Alabama, and the Selma to Montgomery Trail, which was not a new park. It's just gotten more attention over the last several years, especially with the passing of Congressman John Lewis. And I think in so many instances, what they've done is it hasn't just simply been the Park Service coming in and saying, we're going to designate these sites because we think this is important. The work in establishing these parks began in communities. People who had been protecting resources, who had carried that fight for as long as they could, who wanted assistance from an organization like NPCA or the Trust for Historic Preservation in moving that just to the over the final line to get it established as a national park, federally protected in perpetuity for the benefit, enjoyment, and inspiration of the American people. And the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion component is that it requires the National Park Service to do slightly different listening. You've got to be there to find out concerns about things like parking and how a new national park designation might disrupt the neighborhood or the flow of the traffic. But you also want to be there to learn about what are the resources that are important to the story, how do they want to be, and how would people like for them to be interpreted, and are there any themes that the Park Service might be missing if they're not talking to or listening to the people who actually lived through this history. For Birmingham, the story of relevance was the Project C protests, C for confrontation, that were led by Martin Luther King, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and Ralph Abernathy in April and May of 1963. So you've got people who were involved in that process because there were some elementary school age children who protested and who were arrested by the Birmingham Police Department and the Alabama State Police, who are maybe at this point in time in their 60s. So they still remember this history, they lived it. And part of the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion component of that is making sure that it's not just a PhD with a book, but it's members of the community that were engaged in telling and helping the Park Service to determine how the story would be told. So it's a different way of listening. It's a different way of interacting. And, we can also talk about things like tribal co-management, which is a way of elevating domestic dependent nations, American Indian nations or tribes, so that they've got an equal say in how their resources, the stories, and all of the things that are associated with some of the tribal landscapes in there are incorporated in a way that is respectful to the tribe and accurate to their history. The Park Service has gotten a lot better at this over the last several years. They were good to start with. They've gotten better over the last several years. Let's see. From Connie, North Texas Chapter DEI is planning focus groups on use of common names, plants that are sometimes perceived as derogatory. Has NPCA created guidelines on the subject that might be shared with us? We have not created guidelines on that, but we have expressed support for Secretary Deb Haaland, who issued a statement last year, shortly after she was confirmed as Secretary of the Interior, the first Indigenous woman, Native woman to serve as the Secretary of the Interior, that she was conducting a survey of all the names in federally managed lands that are within the Interior Department. So that's Bureau of Land Management, Interior, or National Park Service, and a couple of other agencies like that, to determine what names ought to be scrubbed. And she's looking at things like the use of the word squaw, which is all over the American landscape, and looking at other things that are patently offensive to people of color, people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. And I think that that's long overdue. I think that's good work. And to my own history is as someone who grew up in Washington, D.C., where I won't bother to mention what the name of our football team used to be. It was more than disturbing that the capital of the free world had a pejorative slur for American Indian people as the name of our football team. So I think looking into these things is appropriate. And I just also say it's a little bit funny, maybe more peculiar than ha-ha, that anytime we seem to get something that is truly invasive or deadly, it's an African bee, it's oriental something or other that's growing in the backyard and choking out all the other plants. Everything that's deadly on the planet seems to come from Africa or Asia. And so conducting a review of these names so that we can determine whether or not that's actual, the actual derivation of these things does come from these particular places, or if they're just names that, people placed on something because they felt like associating it with a particular place or a particular people helped to carry the message that it was not good, that it was not Christian, that it was not something that was worth supporting. Within the national park system, there is, for anybody who's ever seen Close Encounters of the Third Time, that cone is known by native people in the area as Mato Tapili, but it got renamed by explorers as Devil's Tower. And so there has to be a conversation about what it means to have seen something like that, to have known that it had a spiritual significance and relevance to native people, and then call it Devil's Tower. And our landscapes are absolutely dotted with those sorts of things. So NPCA does not have a best practices guide that I could share with you, but I think we are interested in seeing what we can do to sort of clean up the landscape. Let's see if we go back to the chat. Current uproar about so-called critical race theory. impacting NPCAs is the current uproar about so-called critical race theory impacting NPCA's efforts to improve Jedi in national parks. Not yet, but we're all standing by. I would share with you that the work I'm doing in Mississippi right now to designate a site that would commemorate the legacy and life of Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, might just be exactly that kind of thing that triggers some of our more conservative friends who have concerns about critical race theory. It's impossible to tell the story without the details of the fact that a 14-year-old African-American kid who came down to Money, Mississippi in the summer of 1955, who evidently whistled at a white woman, was abducted from his uncle Mose Wright's home at gunpoint. He was driven around the Mississippi Delta. He was beaten, tortured, and shot. And then his body was dumped in the Tallahatchie River to never be seen or recovered. The part about race being critical to our history is in how you have two grown white men who can do that to a 14-year-old kid for a very mild alleged offense. And it's at the base of it, it's because of the practices of racism and white supremacy in this country led them to believe that Emmett Till was not a human being that they needed to have any respect for. And we are dealing in this country with centuries of misinformation, disinformation, and bigoted racist information about Black and brown people that works its way into the thinking of a lot of us. And it works its way in because it was the one way that folks could defend the institution of slavery, that folks knew in the day that it was wrong, that it was indefensible, but what you had to do in order to continue to make your profits and continue to benefit from that was to create the argument that the people who were being enslaved had no history, no culture, no poetry, no art, no dance, that they didn't love their families, that they had no science, no economics, no politics, and that they had never made any lasting contributions to the world or to the continent. Once you do that, it's easier to put chains on someone and then put them in a boat and send them across the ocean. And that's the critical part of race, that it is at the heart of all the things that we want to deal with in so many ways. And some of the economic disparities that we see today, a lot of the racism, it's based upon that overwash of sentiment that Black and brown people are just so fundamentally different. The science doesn't support that conclusion. And I'm looking at the diversity in this group and the way that you all are working in Texas to create a more diverse network of master naturalists, of people who care about the environment. So there's more that unites you than divides you. But the critical part of race is that we've got to overcome that being at the hub of what's disconnecting us from one another. And some of our national parks are going to tell really hard stories, and we're going to have to talk about some hard truths. And I would fight against anybody who says that we can't do that because it would make someone feel uncomfortable. And I'll close by sharing, nobody bothered to ask Emmett if he was uncomfortable that morning he was being driven around the Delta and tortured and shot. So we've got to learn about this. We've got to learn about the history of each other, about what makes us, what has brought us to this moment in time, if we're going to have any chance at all of being human with each other. All right, there's more stuff in the chat. It's also okay for rebuttal if you don't agree with anything that I'm saying. Let's see. Okay, what does Jedi stand for? Okay, Cindy answered that one. Thank you. Pam answered that one. From Talat, would you say that with regards to new parks and monuments, we are getting Jedi right more or less? That's a really good question. I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the Park Service is prepared to have these kinds of difficult conversations, but I also think that we're getting better candidates to talk about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's not a lot of need, if you're, well, actually, I take that back. There's a great deal of need if you're going to promote the home of a president, say somebody like Ulysses S. Grant or Harry Truman, some of the more traditional stories that we've got that just sort of assume that, going back to our last subject about critical race theory, that these important men, and they're mostly men that we're talking about on the landscape right now, just somehow kind of made it through. They were self-made. They were born in the log cabin that they built on the frontier. They pulled themselves up by bootstraps that they sewed together themselves, and that they were the chosen few that made it through. I think it's important with the stuff that's already on the landscape that we could begin to re-examine the role of so many people in what made these incredible men as successful as they were. One thing to think about, and it's sort of a bit of a digression, but I'm just headed in this direction, so maybe bear with me for a second, is to ask yourself the question, how much money did somebody like John Adams make when he was in Philadelphia the summer of 1776 in the first session of the Continental Congress? How much money did he make as a congressman? The answer to that is zero. His ability to dress up in powdered wigs and fancy clothes in that horribly hot summer in that confined building in Philadelphia was predicated on the fact that Abigail Adams was back in Massachusetts running the farm and generating revenue and generating money for the Adams family in his absence. So in many ways, John Adams can be regarded as a kept man. That doesn't diminish all the things that he did to help found the country. It doesn't diminish the significance of his history, but what it does is it elevates Abigail Adams. It's not just remember the ladies, but it's remember the ladies were in charge, right? Remember that the ladies were helping to make everything possible for the men folk who were out in front, who got the biographies written about them. And so we have an opportunity, not just with new sites, to talk about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, to be more accurate in our assessment of our history, but we can do that with sites that have been around for 50, 60, 70, 100 years. And I'm looking forward to working with our Park Service colleagues and cultural resources to make exactly that sort of thing happen. All right. Let's see. Okay. I don't know. I'll go to the, okay. What are some ways to get young people involved in representing national park interests? Well, I know that the National Parks Conservation Association has a Young Leaders Council. I think increasingly a lot of environmental and conservation organizations also have that. Could be something that the Texas Master Naturalist thinks about, which is identifying some folks in high school or in college and letting them come into the organization, letting them shadow people, letting them learn from you, and then you also learning from them as a way of prepping the next generation. And would love to hear that. Thanks, Alan. We've already thought about that and have been doing that for the last decade, and I'll shut up about that. But for national parks, I think it is, we work closely through our regional offices, and we've got several staff in Texas that are working on stuff right now. There is a Young Leaders Council in Texas. We bring those people, at least we did in the before times, before COVID hit, to Washington, D.C. to lobby on behalf of national park funding, budget and appropriations, new park designations, and getting them involved and engaged so that they learn about the process. But again, doing that not because we think that national parks are America's best idea, but doing that in such a way that if they spend 3 months, 6 months, a year with NPCA doing this work, getting these kinds of experiences, they can get back into their own communities and they know how to lobby on anything. So we give them skills, the experiences. They could become park advocates. They could become community empowerment champions. They could go on to talk about clean air, clean water, reforms of any variety. So I think it's getting them engaged in ways that are meaningful, both for the organization, but certainly for the people that are coming into it, and letting them know that their voice counts. One of the things that I would also share with you, and just trying to keep an eye on the time so we don't go over, is I talked about being naive, about really feeling that if given the opportunity, we can still live up to the better angels of our nature. And until we get tanks parked outside the Rayburn office building up on Capitol Hill or outside the White House, we still have a participatory democracy. Our voices matter. And if we can share that with young people, if we can make sure that despite the headlines that just keep hammering us and hammering us with tragedy after tragedy, and everybody's hurting, but you can't become inured to this stuff. And we can't get to a point where we think that, okay, it's just time to take the hands off the wheel. And we need to make sure that that next generation, the folks that are following Pam and Mohammed and Ruth and me and all the rest of the folks on this call, that they feel like there's hope, that they feel like there's an obligation to become involved, because I think that's the important stuff. And so however you can manage to make that happen, good on you. And I think we had question from Mead, are there specific goals that are set and measured, and can you talk about that process? So in terms of, it depends really upon what your objectives are. So like I shared, NPCA wants to have 40% of our staff be represented by people of color. And so what we're looking to do at that point in time is you take the all-staff photograph at the picnic, and that's great. And you can see that maybe there are 100 people in the organization, and you've got 25 people that appear to be people of color, people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that's about, 25%. That's a healthy number. But what you also want to do is then turn that photograph on its side and take a core sample. So where are those people of color located? And early on within NPCA, what we noticed is we took the photograph, the all-staff photograph, then turned it on its side for the core sample. And almost all the Black and brown people were working in the mailroom or in accounting or in finance. And I don't want to disrespect, I can't underestimate the ability that those people have to make sure that the rest of us in the organization actually have a place to work, or getting paid on time, getting the mail on time, getting the correspondence out that we need to get out. They play an incredibly important role in the organization. But if your organization is an advocacy organization, if your organization is a Master Naturalist organization, if you are talking about, you've got a mission and a vision, you need to sell more widgets, you need to protect the spotted whale. When you look at the diversity in your staff, you need to make sure that people of color are responsible for the implementation, the development of that mission and that vision. And if people in the mailroom aren't lobbying, if people in the mailroom aren't creating your widgets and then selling them and enhancing them, it is likely that you've got some numbers, but you don't have the commitment from the organization, and you don't have the commitment from the people. And so one measurable thing to do is to look at your leadership cohort within your organization. So it's not just the question of going out to the bus stop and grabbing the first Black people you see and giving them an ID and making them a part of your organization. It's a commitment to figure out how you recruit, how you retain, how you train, and how you bring up and uplift from within the organization people of color, so that your leadership reflects the true face of the United States of America, which is much more racially diverse and complex than sometimes we're led to believe. So measuring things like that and measuring them in those sorts of specific ways, I think, are good ways to move forward. People of color, meaning just African Americans, or also Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and so. Yeah, Frankie, so for me, the term people of color or people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, it's all of those groups combined. It's not just African Americans. And, I think depending upon mission and vision and focus, there are lots of ways to achieve justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it might be that, for someone in the American Southwest, it's got less to do with connecting to an African American constituency than figuring out ways that you can better connect to tribes and be more respectful and engage in more cooperative thinking and planning with tribal entities. We also are seeing expanded opportunities for Asian Pacific Islander Americans in national parks. But we don't have a lot there. We've got, with about 423 units in the national park system right now, and that's everything from Yellowstone and Yosemite to the Frederick Douglass Home or Yorktown Final Victory. We're looking at about 40 sites that are African American experience sites. We don't have those numbers for Asian Pacific Islander Americans. We don't have those numbers for contemporary Latino or Hispanic history, and we got to work on that. So there are definitely some ways to make improvements. Pam?
All right. Thank you so much, Alan. This has been really fascinating. I really appreciate much of what you had to say. Particularly, I'm now going to call Mohammed our Jedi Master. Is that right? Is that all right? Thank you again. A difficult evening in many ways, but I think it was really enlightening. We have surveys that will go out as you exit the program. Those who attended, if you could take time to answer the short survey, we'd really appreciate it. It helps us to evaluate the program, figure out what we're going to do next. Everything helps to create more of the Jedi that we want to create. So thank you again, Alan. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a good evening.